Beware. The Northwoods of America are reportedly filled with some of the most terrifying creatures, from the poisonous hoop snake to the monstrous Hodag. Today we explore the folklore, tall tales, and fantastical yarns surrounding some of the most unbelievable beasts that are said to inhabit the big woods. Our special guest, Chad Lewis, is here to discuss his brand new book, Lumberjack Creatures of the Northwoods. Next on the best in paranormal podcasts, this is Darkness Radio. Hello and welcome. Thank you for tuning into the best in paranormal podcasting. This is Darkness Radio. I'm your host, Dave Schrader. Along with me on today's journey, Tim Dennis. Our guest today, Chad Lewis, one of our favorite guests, is an author, researcher, lecturer on topics of the strange and the unusual. And the more bizarre the legend is, the more likely you'll see Chad investigating it. Welcome back to the show, Chad. Thanks for being here with us.
Greetings from the Northwoods of Wisconsin.
Yes, man, I'll tell you, as I've said on the show, not a big outdoorsman. I've never been, when I was a kid, I liked playing outside for a little bit, but I've never been that outdoorsy type. And your book is going to cement reasons why I'm not an outdoorsy type. So I'm glad that we're able to connect and, hopefully instill the fear in the rest of the world that I have every time I step into a wooded area, Chad.
Well, are they allowing you to stay in Minnesota with that view?
Yeah, because I stay in my house and they don't have to see me or put up with me. So they prefer that. You've always got your finger on the pulse of the strange and bizarre stories in society. But why turn to the creatures of the Northwoods? What attracted you to this part of our history?
I love the fringe folklore, the things that are on the edge of the supernatural and paranormal topics. But growing up in Wisconsin, I always heard of stories of Paul Bunyan and tales of the lumberjack legends and lore and how amazing these animals were. And most of them had been nearly forgotten. So I thought I'd put together some of my favorite creatures that were said to exist in the big woods from the entire United States.
Now, it's funny. My mom grew up in Wisconsin. She grew up in a town called Marinette, Wisconsin. And one of her favorite stories to tell me was when she was a little girl, there was a sledding hill not far from her. And she would, they'd gotten some fresh powder. She was little. She was excited. She saw that there were kids and an adult up on the sledding hill, running up the hill, sliding down the hill. So mom grabs her sled and starts trekking her way out there. But as she got closer, she realized these things were huge and hairy. And they weren't people, running up the hill and sliding back down the hill. Now, Chad, I wish I could tell you it was an infamous encounter with Sasquatch. Turned out it was just a family of black bears enjoying the snow. But again, that was one of her moments of she had no clue what she was looking at first. But she knew it didn't look normal, and it certainly wasn't the neighbor kids out there sliding up and down the hill. There's a lot of natural creatures out there that are oftentimes mistaken for other things, right? And now that we've seen photographs of bears and dogs with mange, how creepy and strange they can look out in the wilderness, how many of these visitations or accidental encounters do you believe are normal animals that just may be sick, dealing with mange, or somebody that's unfamiliar with the actual creatures of the area and make assumptions?
A lot of the lumberjack creatures, and I love your story, by the way, were based on real creatures of the Northwoods. And remember, when logging was in its heyday in the late 1800s to even early 1900s, the big woods of America, whether it was in Vermont, Maine, out west in Oregon, Washington, or here in the Great Lakes, they were thought to be endless, that you could never cut down the woods. They were just too big, and that there was an idea that anything could be in there. Anything was possible. And a lot of these creatures kind of came from regular animals, like the hoop snake. It was a regular snake, but it was able to grab its tail in its mouth and form a hoop and it could chase you no matter how fast you ran. It could keep up with you, and then it would strike you with its tail and poison you. So it was obviously based on real snakes in the woods that people feared, but it gave it that little embellishment, that little strangeness to keep people on their toes.
Well, there's a lot of tales of strange activity and creatures that seem to exist just outside the fringes of normalcy, right? And a lot of lumberjacks have shared stories of these creatures. I remember there were lumberjacks in and around the Mount St. Helens area that claimed that they would run into creatures, full-blooded Bigfoot-like creatures, but they kept all of this under wraps because that was their industry. That was their business. And by talking about this, they would talk amongst themselves, but never really with the outsiders, because there was a fear if science realizes these creatures are real, they're going to shut down logging in these areas because they don't want to keep encroaching or infringing on the natural habitat for these beasts.
There was a strong difference between what the lumberjacks obviously created or imagined of these creatures. For instance, one of them was this beasquito that in the Northwoods, people were having trouble with.
I want to soak that title in. Tim, how many of those do you think we've encountered in our years here in Minnesota? The beasquito.
Oh, 30 or 35, I'm sure. Yeah.
Holy cow. Yeah, we have pterodactyl skeetos here in Minnesota, Chad. I don't know. Your cute little beasquitos are nice, but we have these monsters that are here in the Minnesota Northwoods, man. We got to step up our game. Beasquito, though, I've got to hear more.
Well, that was the exact reason that Paul Bunyan came up with a solution, because the bugs and mosquitoes were so bad in Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin that they could pluck lumberjacks right off of their workstations and they'd never be seen again. And they had to get rid of them. Even though logging was done mostly in the winter, it didn't matter for these mosquitoes, as you all too well know. So Paul came up with an idea. He had remembered down south, he was plagued by giant bees. So he went down south and gathered up those bees and brought them back to the Midwest in order to kill all the giant mosquitoes. But his plan backfired and they got along really well. They started mating and marrying, and they came, their offspring were beasquitos, which they had a stinger on the front and the back, a combination of mosquito and bee, and it could sting you whether you were coming or going.
Yeah, see, these are the reasons I'm not an avid outdoorsman. I mean, when you just look at the natural creatures like ticks, right? That's just icky enough. Ticks and leeches, and then sticks. Sticks are dirty and pokey, Chad. Very dirty and pokey and cause nothing but harm. I don't know why you would even consider going into places where there might be beasquitos. Was this a lot of folklore and fable talk from these lumberjacks who maybe spent too much time away from regular civilization and maybe more time with the bottle?
It really was, for the fact that thousands, tens of thousands of men in America would head up north every winter season or logging season, leave their friends, family, farm behind, and they'd log all winter and then come back to the family farm when the season was over. And after their exhausting day in the woods, the only thing they did is came back to the bunkhouse where everyone stayed and spun tall tales and yarns around the fire. But in addition to these weird creatures like the beasquito, they often talked about creatures that we would consider to be more in the realm of cryptozoology. Bigfoot type creatures, which back then they called the wild man or the wild men. They talked about these will-o'-the-wisp, these spook lights. They talked about ghosts in the woods. So in addition to some of these more fanciful creatures that were often talked about with a wink and a nudge, they did talk about creatures that we're still studying today in the field of cryptozoology or the supernatural.
Well, looking at some of these tales, do you think that some of the folklore, again, was set up as a way, obviously moms and dads will tell spooky stories of, beasts in the woods or in the water so that keeps their children safe and away from the water's edge, away from the dark woods where there are legitimate creatures, from mountain lions to coyotes, wolves, and bears. And sometimes that's not enough to make an impact on our children, so we amp the stories up. Do you think that some of these stories were made so that outsiders would not wander into that territory and muck with their livelihood? that maybe it was a way to keep the women in their lives at bay so that they didn't come up there because look at what I have to face making this money for you. I'm doing this for you. Do you think there was aspects of that as they would spin these yarns and continue to create these tales?
Certainly, I believe that. And also to scare away potential wood poachers that oftentimes competing lumber companies would simply just start cutting on the edge of somebody else's property. So if you could try to scare them by saying there's something that was dangerous to you, something that would take your life, or at the very worst, injure you and retire you, basically, that was meant to keep people away. But it was also meant to scare and entertain the greenhorns, the rookie young lumberjacks that would come into camp and have never stepped foot in the big woods and had no idea what could possibly be waiting or lurking for them.
Very cool. Well, when you're talking about, like, you introduced the hoop snake, and you talk about this now, were these stories based on things that obviously in a lot of folklore and fables, there is a nugget of truth. I mean, were there certain aspects of creatures and things that were witnessed by lumberjacks that you think, took on a life of their own? And what can we find scientifically that would match up with a creature like the hoop snake?
That was one of the interesting things about doing this research, is that most people think of these in the same realm as Paul Bunyan tales, that they're just folk tales and yarns spun. But I found a lot of newspaper accounts of people actually encountering or believing they encountered these things. And it was very common for people in the 1800s, early 1900s, to claim that they had been walking down a street when all of a sudden they saw the dirt spinning around and a dust storm coming, and that a hoop snake was coming right at them. And they could either flee or try to fight it with their walking stick or their cane. And these weren't lumbermen and women. They weren't people whose job it was to promote folklore. They were simple mom and pop folks who claimed to actually encounter these things during their everyday lives.
Now, again, going out into the woods, it's got to be crazy. And you have got to see a lot of creatures. Were there creatures that, obviously, aside from Sasquatch and Chupacabra and Dogman, which we hear about quite a bit now, were there creatures that they would describe that now science has proven do exist?
I think so. I think one of the creatures they described was this Hodag. And beautiful name. And if you were to think of some Frankenstein type Sesame Street snuffleupagus, that's what you would see. This giant snuffleupagus creature with a mouth that would hang down to the ground, that would walk around. It had no knees, so it couldn't bend its legs. But if anyone were to see that from a certain angle or a different view of it, obstructed a little bit, you would think 100% that was a moose. So it's obvious that they may have seen a moose up in that area, had never seen it before, and all of a sudden the lips got a little longer, that got a little bit stranger. Maybe the actual dimensions and weight and height of it were exaggerated a bit. But if you Google Hodag, you'll see that how easily that could have been derived or originated from the moose.
Well, right. And people should know moose and elk are monstrous creatures, right? They almost look mythical when you see full grown representations of these in the wild.
Oh, I was a few years back, long before the COVID stopped travel. I was in Canada talking to truck drivers who were deathly afraid of driving at night because of the moose that would come out to the roads to lick the salt from the roads that were sprayed on there. And they would often hit them. And they told me you would not imagine the damage that a moose can do to a big semi-truck because they are truly gigantic. If you see one in the wild, it's almost unbelievable how big they are.
We've been in Estes Park, Colorado, near the elk, which are monstrous. There's moose. We've seen them. I've seen them as close as I could in a zoo, Chad. I don't know if you've heard about these places. They're exhibit places for animals. but I've gone and seen it, and you do. And I think to myself all the time, this is why I don't go in the woods. What do you do if you run into a moose? Or if you did run into a Sasquatch, what is the game plan for doing something like this? And I've just, I kind of like letting that stay in other people's hands, dealing with, with nature's beauty and splendor. I like to do it from behind my TV screen and watch it happen on videos gone wrong with animal encounters. That to me seems like a much better place to be during these hunting seasons, instead of worrying that my friend may shoot me by accident or possibly on purpose, depending on the day, or what's going on out there. There's just too much going on in the wooded areas. But I said when I grew up in Chicago, but my grandparents owned 40 acres in Alabama. We would hear large things tromping around all the time, and Bigfoot never crossed my mind until we had what I think was a viewing of one. But I always sat there with my cousin on the bench. We'd be fishing and you'd hear these loud footsteps and things ambling. And I was like, as a kid, you're like, oh, are there gorillas? Are there, lions back there? Because I didn't realize how that all works, right? I'm just a dumb little kid. And I've seen them at the zoo, so that means they must be out in the wild. But I sit now as an adult and wonder, what kind of stuff is out there? And it is easy in 40 acres to get lost back there. And if you are an animal that knows your way around, to be stealthy. I can't tell you how many times I'd be sitting there and doing something, and all of a sudden I'd realize there were creatures all around me, from snakes to squirrels to skunks that were all within an arm's length away. And if you're not adept at paying attention or knowing what you're even looking for, how easily you could pass by natural creatures. Then you talk about the preternatural creatures and things like Bigfoot and the Hodag or whatever these things might be. I could see how you could even walk past something like that because it's in its natural state. It's probably adapted to these areas and knows how to blend in or what it can do to make itself less visually noticeable in a lot of their own surroundings.
Most people have a very difficult time of seeing wildlife, whether you're going to a national forest or a national park, especially if you're out hiking, that very often you pass by wildlife because, as you said, they're masters at blending in and avoiding you. And unless you're taking it slow and specifically looking for them, you probably won't find them. And I'm always amazed at, as you mentioned, how easy it is to get turned around in a relatively small area of woods. And that's not counting the jungle or the rainforest where you can walk 5 feet in. I was in Central America in many rainforests where you walk 5 feet in. If somebody spun you around, you wouldn't know which way you just came from. It's that thick, and it doesn't take a big forest in order for people to get turned around and frightened. And today, a lot of people who camp that are not from rural areas, they're amazed by the sounds at night of these creatures lurking about, as you said, skunks, raccoons, and then larger mammals as well. But I think as more and more people move from the countryside to cities, we forget that there's a lot of other things besides us out there.
Well, obviously we've all heard a lot of the stranger things that have been reported. What were some of the surprises to you in uncovering folklore and legends that have been around maybe even a couple hundred years, but still have not come to the public light?
I'm amazed at just the vast assortment of these creatures. When we're talking just specifically lumberjack creatures, researchers, folklorists, sociologists of the old days recorded over 100 different creatures that were thought to be roaming the woods. And this is not including the paranormal side. This is just the camp tale side of 100 different creatures. Most of them had been forgotten about, as with the lumber industry. Most people have no idea how important the lumberjack and the lumber industry was to making America, from cutting down trees, not only employing the lumberjacks, but making shingles for your house, wood for your house, tools, equipment. Everything was done from wood. It really was the economic engine of the late 1800s.
All right. Well, let's dig into a couple more of these tall tales that you've been able to include in the new book. And again, we have a link for it to the book on today's program guide, folks, so you can find it there. Lumberjack Creatures of the Northwoods. It's up and available. Just came out at the beginning of August here. So the link is, and I love the cover art that you have on this one, Chad. It looks like a lot of fun and a great catchy visualization of some of the creatures that we've already discussed.
And that was my goal, is these creatures were meant to be, yes, scary, yes, terrifying, and sometimes deadly, but also they were meant to be talked about while you're up in the Northwoods cabin sitting around your campfire, or if you throw up your tent at the local campground, discussing when you're sitting around the fire, was that just nearby noise, or was that the jackalope singing along with you from the edge of your vision?
Creepy stuff. Well, the jackalope. Now, I remember going into bars with my uncles and dad and such, and there would be the jackalope, a little cute bunny rabbit with horns. And they would tell me tales of the jackalope and the snipe and other strange creatures, right, that you would encounter, which, again, now that I'm realizing that may explain why I've got this unnatural fear of being in the woods. I've been lied to my whole life, apparently, Chad. But what is the jackalope, and what's the history behind it? Do you know?
If any of your listeners are familiar with Lumberjack Creatures, they're probably familiar with the iconic jackalope. It's ubiquitous across the U.S., and as its name implies, it really looks like a mix between a jackrabbit that has antlers on its head, giant antlers of a deer, or the horns and antlers of an antelope, as the name implies. And you can go to any tourist shop and stop in, or roadside attraction, and see both thought to be stuffed jackalope and recreations of the jackalope. And the origin comes from two men out west who happened to make one. They were taxidermists who made one as a joke and decided to sell it. And they received so many reports and requests for it that they continued on. But others claim that it was the cowboys out on the western plains that would sit around singing songs at night by the fire, when they would hear these jackalopes mimicking their songs and singing along with them. And the jackalope spread from there all over the United States. And there are so many tales of the jackalope. I can't tell you how many people have contacted me seriously saying they believe they've seen a jackalope while out in the wilds of America.
Well, again, maybe the way the rabbit was hiding or sitting there were branches near him, which gave the appearance of antlers. But is there any known excuse for why people would believe that? I know that, humans can develop an issue. Believe it or not, they can grow horns. They're kind of these strange mutations and bone mutations. But if you look them up, folks, there was an Asian woman that was very prominent with this. She grew one horn and then was very excited when she grew a second horn. And people thought it was insane, but it can happen. Are there any known examples of, either it's some kind of pest, like I don't even know what other kind of creatures would be out there feeding off of rabbits. But is there anything that would give us an indication to why people might make that mistake as believing they see these things?
Most people blame the jackalope on a virus, the papilloma virus rabbits can get. And it's a cancerous growth that appears to look like a bony horn substance coming out, usually of their face. But when you see these, if you look them up, you see they're much different from our idea of what the jackalope looks like. It looks disgusting as they have these tumor growths coming out of their face. And a lot of people equate that to the origin of the jackalope, that people were seeing these things often at night from a far distance. Perhaps they'd been drinking around the camp. Maybe these were antlers, because that made the most sense. So a lot of people do believe that it came from a virus that created these jackalope figures.
Very cool. But they would mimic human voices and sing along. That was part of their legend and history.
Yes, and then since then it's spread. Obviously, the lumberjacks said that they would hum along to the saws as they were cutting down the woods. The cowboys said they would sing and be harmonizing with the songs. And even people said you could lure them in with spirits. And the most favorite was whiskey. So much so that it was said that the cowboys stopped doing it because it was too easy to capture jackalopes because they could not pass by the hard alcohol. So you could lure these things in, which in the Midwest, I imagine a lot of these jackalopes coming to many of the fire camps.
Yeah, I would guess so. But it's funny how all these good stories might revolve around the use of alcohol and whiskey near a campfire.
It really was. There was a creature called the snow snake, and it only came out in winter after the first snow because it was pure white, and it could not see it on the snow, and it could attack everybody without any warning. And it would, if it attacked you, you would die, but not from poisoning. It was said that you would freeze to death. And the only antidote out there was, of course, spirits, alcohol, whiskey. That could cure a snow snake bite. And some of the newspapers claim that when they talked to some of the old time lumberjacks and asked how much whiskey it actually took to cure a bite, they said by the time you're falling off your stool, you should be cured from a snow snake bite.
I like that. That is very inventive. I could see my uncle sitting around a campfire trying to sell that to my mom and aunt, and as a reason as why they have to bring whiskey with on their hunting trips.
Well, a lot of the lumber camps did not allow liquor to be there during the season. Just too many troubles, too many problems. But
sure,
there is a story of a lumberjack who wanted to bring some whiskey for Christmas. So he bought it back in September, and he brought it to the lumber camp and buried it in the ground, waiting for Christmas Eve night where he'd break it out and celebrate everybody. And when he went and got it on Christmas, it was rotten whiskey. So when spring came along, he went back to the bar he bought it from, and he said, "I want my money back. You sold me bad whiskey." And the bartender, quick on his feet, said, "Oh, I thought you wanted summer whiskey. I didn't know you wanted winter whiskey. We have two different types." And the lumberjack was confused and walked out happy.
The old winter whiskey and the summer whiskey. Yeah, that's we are a foolish group, huh? P.T. Barnum was not wrong. A sucker born every day. Crazy stories. Now, I'm curious, with all of your research, Chad, where do you stand on the concepts of Bigfoot and Dogman stories now? Do you believe that these are grounded in reality? Are they, imaginary beasts? Are they something that maybe we've created like a thought form because of people's fascination with werewolf culture and Bigfoot culture? What do you think is going on out there?
I'm amazed by the fact that when you start digging into the werewolf legends or the Dogman, Michigan legends, you find that even though they're very popular today and have seemed to reach widespread, knowledge of them, they really have a long history. I was up in northern Michigan talking to people about this creature they call the witchy wolves, these werewolf dogmen-like creatures that they think inhabit an area on the outskirts of their town, but they saw them more as protectors of native land, that there were legends that people were disturbing ancient burial grounds and that these creatures were brought forward to protect that area. But I talked to people who recalled back in the 1950s hearing stories of kids going out to Lover's Lane or Makeout Points and being scratched and terrorized by these giant dogmen-like creatures. So even though they seem to be more modern in a lot of our appreciation of them, the stories link back many, many generations. At least the belief in them dates back farther than we anticipated.
We're up against a break here, folks. I want to make a quick mention again. I'm sorry about last Thursday's show, the live show that was supposed to take place, as explained on yesterday's show. I went into a little bit of that, of why I wasn't here. We do have a makeup show we're going to be doing this Thursday. We're shuffling our guests around, so we're going to still do some of the live shows coming up here and continue to bring you some great programming. But we do have a brand new show, and kind of following in the last 3 or 4 that have aired, talking about intention and manifestation. I've got an amazing guest. Dr. Greg Hammer, MD, is going to join us, and we're going to talk about setting intentions, how it can change the brain and your physical being. So we're taking it beyond the realm of the paranormal and supernatural into the realm of science with a Stanford professor and physician discussing this with us. That's live tomorrow on the Best in Paranormal Pod, or tonight, I should say, not tomorrow, live tonight on the Best in Paranormal Podcast, Darkness Radio Live. You can find us on our social media pages and on the Darkness Radio YouTube page. Go follow the Darkness Radio YouTube page, hit the bell, and like it, so that way you can keep up with all the new content as it becomes available. Be a part of the live shows so that you can watch along and we can involve your questions throughout. We have to take a quick break. We'll come back. We've got more with our guest, Chad Lewis, when we return to the Best in Paranormal Talk Radio. This is Darkness Radio. We're back with Lumberjack Creatures of the Northwoods. Chad Lewis, our friend and author, researcher, investigator, is back telling us some of these interesting tales of strange creatures. Are there many dangerous creatures reported in here? I mean, obviously, they all have a air of danger to them, like the snow snake. If you don't happen to have some good whiskey on hand to negate the frostbite of these snow snakes, you could be doomed. But what do we know of other type of creatures and the danger levels involved in encountering them?
Most of these creatures were deadly beasts, and a lot of the explanation was that they were upset with lumberjacks for invading their territory. And remember, this was the day when lumber industry was just clear cutting everything. There was no thought into replanting trees or managing a forest. It was just wiped out, and then they would sell the land for cheap for anyone who wanted to come up and farm it, if you could pull thousands of stumps and dynamite them off your land. So they were creating these huge fields that weren't there. So a lot of these animals were said to be very angry with humans for destroying their habitat, which is why they would take great measures in to try to harm and kill and carry off lumberjacks. One of the most feared creatures was this beast called the hide behind. And like its name implies, it would always be hiding behind you in the forest. And I think a lot of people who are out walking, hiking, and all of a sudden get that feeling that something's behind them. But when they turn around, nothing's there, and they keep walking. That was the fear of the hide behind. And it was said that if you stood there, it would be behind you. If you jumped 180 degrees, it would still be behind you. And it was so good at hiding behind things that the legend was the hide behind could hide behind itself. That's how good of a hider it was.
Man, the more you hear these, the more you realize how much liquor was involved in the creation of these beings. I'm just saying, I don't mean to sound jaded, but that definitely sounds like somebody was chewing on some of the natural mushrooms in the woods a little too long, Chad.
Yeah, and it was. And these hide behind would grab you and take you off to their lair. There was the splinter cat, which at night when you're in your bunkhouse and blizzards are whipping through the woods, knocking over trees and limbs, you have to explain that away. And you wouldn't explain it as just weather conditions. You would explain it by these animals like the splinter cat, which was the size of a mountain lion, but it had an anvil for a head, really hard, and it would jump out of trees looking for bees' nests and smash into a tree with its head, crashing it open and look for bees' nests. And of course, being that it was of low intelligence, oftentimes it would mistake a lumberjack for a tree and dive into your chest and smash you and kill you by the splinter cat. And that was more reasonable to the lumberjacks than high winds and blizzards knocking over trees.
That made more sense to them.
Yeah, it really did. And then these stories, what's interesting is these stories were always done not in a manner of straightforwardness where you start at the beginning of the story and then you finish it. Somebody would start a story and then someone else in the bunkhouse would interject and say, you're getting it wrong. I was actually there. This is what the monster looks like, or this is my friend I lost to this creature. So it was never told the same way twice and always morphed and progressed. And these stories were often told to scare the new greenhorns in camp.
Oh, so this was kind of an indoctrination story as well. Would they send some of these newbies out to go face these creatures or face the fears as kind of a hazing ritual at all?
They would often talk about the will-o'-the-wisp, these spook lights, these mysterious lights that would be in the woods. And in fact, they would be in the woods. Quite a few accounts of these, what you might consider UFOs if you're into that field, or, ball lightning, gas if you're more skeptical. But these mysterious lights that would appear in the marsh and the areas of the lumber, and they would send these young lumberjacks out into the woods to capture them. And they'd say everyone can capture them within an hour. And these lumberjacks would stay out there all night and come back empty-handed, of course. And the rest of the old lumberjacks would simply laugh. And it would be like a rite of passage, an initiation that you're one of us now. But they would base it on real folklore that was actually happening.
We talk about ball lightning in passing on a lot of these episodes. This is an explanation. Chad, what is your understanding? What really is ball lightning? And is this a natural phenomena that can just happen anywhere at any time?
I think a lot of people come to the conclusion that it had to be ball lightning, but ball lightning's relatively rare. I have not spoken with a lot of people who have actually seen it. Scientists talk about it, that it's lightning that usually runs along fence posts or other objects, and it forms like a ball moving very bright and very fast. But a lot of the people that I've spoken with that have seen these lights, these spook lights, if you will, they say they move around and dart about, often changing in size, shape, and color, and they seem to be controlled by some intelligent maneuvering, that they're not just randomly moving down a fence line, that they've even been chased by these things. There's a pretty infamous place in Wisconsin called the Devil's Punch Bowl, where these bright lights have been spotted quite a bit. And I spoke with a group of young teenagers that were parked in the parking lot debating whether they should go down into the punch bowl itself. And they saw this bright light coming toward their car. And they told me that the bright light actually entered inside their car. And when I asked them what they did, they all looked at me as though I was crazy. They said, "We got out of the car." But they felt this light was targeting them, that it wasn't just some random burst of lightning coming through and, warding off its power. It was something that knew they were there and maybe didn't want them there.
Now, these will-o'-the-wisp type stories, these creatures of light that would move through, I always thought, lightning bugs kind of looked like that kind of creature. Were the will-o'-the-wisp supposed to be bigger, or were they kind of the fairy or fae folk?
I would equate them more with the fairy, the little people, the gnomes, the goblins, the spirits, the sprites, the little folk, the hidden peoples, as they're much bigger. Most of the reports I get from these lights are at least the size of a baseball, sometimes even into the size of a basketball, often associated with haunted areas or areas of supernatural reports, what John Keel would call window areas, or maybe portals, if you will. Many skeptics would call it swamp gas of the time, but most of these sightings were much bigger than little fireflies. Although there was a haunted case of a bridge called Green Eyes Bridge that people would report going out to this bridge and seeing green eyes of a former owner of the land, his ghost haunting this bridge. And when you did go out there, you would see it was just overrun with fireflies flashing. And I thought that would be probably very common for people who go out there thinking it's haunted to see these bursts of light, thinking it was the eyes of a murdering ghost who once roamed the area.
Oh, that's creepy in itself. Do a lot of the locations tie into mysterious deaths and strange phenomena like that? That doesn't just mean natural creatures that might be living there, but unnatural creatures that seem to maybe move between realms. What kind of weird fables and folklore do we have that surrounds or is built up around that?
A lot of these areas seem to be paranormal beacons where I've discovered in my nearly 30 years of doing this that a lot of areas that often have reports of many different phenomenon happening. Phenomena happening there, that you'll get reports of UFOs and hauntings and cryptids and weird things happening all in this area, as though it's something about the land or the people there that is causing it or allowing it to be viewed, versus other areas. There are these hot spots where these sightings continue decade after decade, sometimes pausing for several decades, but then continuing on in this certain area. And many times when I hear of a new case of somebody telling me about a haunted story or a creature, it won't surprise me because I have old stories of the same thing happening 50, 100 years ago.
Do you think that they're aware of these stories again through oral tradition and the story, like a game of telephone, just changes through the years? Or do you notice that some of these stories are independent without them being aware of any of the past stories and histories, as though there is something embedded in that land?
I think a little bit of both. The previous book I had done was on supernatural dares, places where you can go and knock on a mausoleum and a ghost will said to appear. And a lot of these stories were passed down from generation to generation, usually with younger teenagers who saw it as a test of bravery, that they can stay out on the haunted road longer than their friends, or as a rite of passage to take this dare and do it with your friends and prove your bravery. And they knew of these stories, and they changed every year with every passing generation. They changed a little bit in their storytelling. But then at the same time, I get reports from people who have no idea about the legend. Recently, I received a report from a man in Iowa. He was a pastor waiting for his friend at a meeting out in the country, and he saw what he thought was this giant dragon in the sky, this pterodactyl being flying in the sky. And he watched her for a few moments, and it was gone. He went home, Googled Iowa dragon, and saw what came up was a creature called the Van Meter Visitor. And he said, that's exactly what I saw. I'd never heard of it before, but this is exactly what I saw in the sky, not knowing that the first reports came from 1903.
That's funny, right? So he just looked up keywords to see this and to realize that there are stories that predate. So again, what do you think is the background for this, Chad? Are we, because of the legends and lores and the oral traditions of history, are we creating and manifesting supernatural occurrences and beings by just breathing life into them with the history and the spoken word?
For a lot of people, I've discovered over the years that if you go to a place expecting something supernatural or paranormal to happen, it is more likely that it will happen than if you weren't expecting it. The old saying, seeing is believing, but maybe believing equals seeing. And I'm not sure if that's because when we think something's going to happen at a haunted cemetery or an old abandoned insane asylum or a far away back road, that you imagine it more, you project it more, or is having that open mind opening you up to experiencing it more that you wouldn't have if you wouldn't have come in that mindset. And for me, with my background in psychology, that's the hardest question is I don't know, but I can tell you that it does seem like the more likely you expect something to happen, it will happen whether you're manifesting it or not.
All right. Going back into some of more of the legendary creatures, and I know you cover over 20 creatures in this book. What was another one of your favorite strange stories?
Today, I'm not a week goes by where I don't get a request from somebody saying, where can I go see the Hodag? Where can I capture one? Where can I track it? What can I do to get close to these creatures? And of course, the Hodag is up there with the jackalope for its infamy. And it looks like a big half crocodile, half lizard creature. Gigantic horns, tusks, scales going down its back. It looks like a triceratops, if you will, but deadlier and scarier. And the story of the Hodag began back in the late 1800s, and then it really blossomed when a Rhinelander tourism promoter, Eugene Shepard, claimed that he captured one in the woods of Wisconsin. And he put this thing on display at the local carnival and county fairs before moving it to his house, where he would put it on display and charge people to come and see it. And he'd have a big pit dug in his house, in his front yard, and he'd have his kids down there moving this mechanical Hodag around. And when people found out it was a hoax, more people went to see it than when they thought it was real. And Mr. Shepard said that, yes, his was a hoax, but the only reason he hoaxed it was that they were too dangerous for him to capture, that he had seen several of them, and he wasn't able to capture one, so he recreated it to show everybody what the Hodag actually looked like. And to this day, people want to go Hodag hunting.
That's plausible deniability right there, my friend. Hey, listen, yeah, I faked it, but I'm giving you the best representation of the thing I saw.
And people flocked to it. And this was a time when people were familiar with hoaxes. They knew of the Cardiff Giant hoax. They knew of the Fiji Mermaid hoax. P.T. Barnum's museums and his eventual circus were gaining huge popularity. So even though they were being fooled, a lot of Americans loved going there for the fun of it, the wonder of it. And they weren't too upset when they found out it was his kids moving around this mechanical beast down in the hole. They bought the postcards and moved on and had a happy time.
Good grief. Now, do you see, I know this is kind of focused in one area, but do you see that there are competing stories that line up with almost the same kind of accounts across the United States in different areas where lumberjacks are prevalent and working?
A lot of these stories are from all over the U.S. And when I labeled them Northwoods, people often think of the Great Lakes and northern Vermont and Maine, but they forget that in the southern states, they had the Northwoods of those states as well. And these were usually the heavy forested areas that the lumber industry worked in. So even though it's the Northwoods, it's relative to what state you're in. And even though there were some regional characters and creatures that only existed in pockets of a small area in that region, most of these were all over the United States. So no matter where you were living outside of the snow creatures, you could encounter the hoop snake, for instance, or the goofus bird, a bird that would fly backwards because it didn't care where it was going. It only cared where it had been. So it would fly backwards, and people would, people would see it.
I know a lot of people that are like that, Chad.
Yeah, it's not only the bird species.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So these were everywhere, and people were seeing the same thing. And much like with the supernatural or paranormal, that you would have all these separate cultures interpreting and seeing what appeared to be the same things, even though they weren't aware of these other legends, which to me adds so much more credibility to the folklore when you have people thousands of miles apart seeing the same exact thing without knowing other people are seeing it. For me, that makes it much, much more puzzling than if it were just in a certain area only.
All right, but with that said, lumberjacks are nomadic people. That they might make their way to other states and get jobs there. That's most likely how this extended game of telephone goes, isn't it?
It really was. It was the Canadian lumberjacks, and then they would go into the Northeast, Vermont, Maine, and then they followed the way to the Great Lakes and then out west to Oregon, Washington, and then down south. That was the pattern of the lumberjack. And the lumberjack would often move camps during the season, not because of how much pay was offered, not because the cleanliness of the lumber camp, if they didn't have as much lice or bed bugs roaming through, but they moved mostly on the condition of how good the cook was. That's what offered them the most incentive, is how good the cooking was at the lumber camp. Because remember, you're working from what they used to call can't see to can't see, meaning that they would get up for work long before the sun came up, and they would not return until long after the sun went down. And they would eat 3 meals a day, and that would sustain them. So they would have to eat an enormous amount of calories. So food became their number one concern, which is why at breakfast, lumberjacks would not talk. Because if you were talking, you were not eating. So talking was not allowed at the breakfast tables because you had to cram so much food down your throat to sustain yourself for those 14-hour days.
Strange rituals when it comes to jobs like this, right? Do you believe that there are credible sightings of again, kind of going back to the Bigfoot, wild man, Sasquatch? Do you believe that lumberjacks do have a unique perspective on this? Or do you think a lot of it is them infusing themselves into the local legends and lore of the surrounding area?
Some of it, like the goofus bird, which also not only flies backwards, but builds its nest upside down somehow, obviously were fun characters that they made up. But when we look at lumberjacks, many of them spent their winter in the woods when no one else was in there. Nobody else was that deep in the woods. So these were the local on-the-ground experts, seeing what was going on. So I think a lot of the folklore that they discovered is still with us today, of the wild men stories, seeing these hairy, gigantic beasts out in the woods. Of course, as I mentioned, they wouldn't call them Bigfoot or Sasquatch back then, but they were depicting the same type of creature we have today. So in some regards, when we take out a lot of the sexist, racist stories of the lumberjacks and sexual stories of the lumberjacks, what we're left with is a lot of good folklore from that era.
All right, very cool. Let's dig deep into these stories and get a few more before we have to part ways. What are some of the other more popular and maybe more obscure legends?
A lot of these stories came with the immigrants that came over. What was interesting about the lumber camp is it was an equal opportunity employer back in the 1800s. No matter where you were from, your skin color, your language, your religion, if you worked as hard as the next guy, you got paid the same thing, which is why there were so many Native American lumberjacks, African American lumberjacks. The old joke is that on any given night at the lumber camp, you could hear snoring in 10 different languages. So they brought a lot of their legends and creatures with them. So even though there are a ton of lumberjack creatures, there's also stories of werewolves and vampires and other creatures that people brought from the old countries. But one of my favorite creatures, obviously, is Babe the Blue Ox. Perhaps the most infamous of them all, the friend of Paul Bunyan. And Babe was thought to be this real creature that Paul found in the snow. And it was the winter of the blue snow. The temperatures were so cold that the fish grew fur, and that the snow turned blue because everyone was cursing a blue streak for so long. And Paul found Babe turned blue in the snow, and he brought him into his camp. And like everything around Paul Bunyan, Babe grew to an enormous size. And the folklore tells of Paul and Babe making the 10,000 lakes of Minnesota with their footprints, and making the Grand Canyon and clearing North Dakota of all of its trees. So although people see Paul Bunyan as this kid's fairy tale or tall tale legend, We base a lot of our stories and our entertainment around Paul and Babe.
Right. Well, that gives, again, the legend and lore of how these things came to be. But again, you know that the tall tales and folklores of Johnny Appleseed and Paul Bunyan and Babe the Big Blue Ox and stories like that played a contemporary part of painting an interesting history for kids, right? And for travelers to learn a little bit about it with a story, a fun story, John Henry Irons and, you know, and things like that. You'd hear of all these weird tall tales, but it was really in a way to kind of build the legacy of these locations and the history surrounding them.
And if you look at Paul Bunyan from the early days of what they thought he looked like a wild man, a caveman, unruly hair, dark all over with soot and being in the woods. Of course, he was huge and burly, but he looked more like a caveman walking into modern times. And then he softened a bit when they started using him in the 1920s and 30s to promote wood products and lumber yards. He was a little bit heavier set and a little bit more like your uncle that would tell great stories with a cigar around the fire. And eventually he reverted back to what we think of him today with the red flannel coat and the really big with suspenders and very muscular. But a lot of the lumberjacks were not like that. They were 5'2" to 5'4", maybe 150 pounds, which was the average size at that time. Although they could work the entire day and never seemingly get tired, they weren't what we think of the stereotypical lumberjack of today.
Now, do we hear much with the tales of kind of anamorphic, or not anamorphic, what's the word I'm looking for? Lycanthropic creatures, if you will, things that change and manipulate and shift like wolves and werewolves and other creatures of the night like that? Or does that kind of the more terror creatures, you know, not really fit into the lumberjack lore itself?
There were a lot of these creatures that seemed to fit into the category of the shapeshifter or at least the trickster motif that is out there. There was one creature called the Tote Road Sagamaw, and it was this huge creature, and no one could track it because they would track it for a while, and it would seem to be leaving bear prints. But then all of a sudden the bear prints would stop, and it would go to a moose, and then vice versa, back and forth. And it wasn't until someone caught a glimpse of this creature that said to be this Frankenstein hodgepodge of bear, moose, and other creatures. And as much as we think that is a far-flung tall tale, back in the early 1900s in Minnesota, posses of hundreds of men gathered around the Lake of the Woods area hunting for this creature they called the devil moose. That it was a moose that was comprised of many different body parts of animals, and that eyewitnesses claimed that they had seen it. And again, these huge hunting parties gathered for many weeks on end, going into the big woods of Minnesota, trying to capture the devil moose, which of course they never did. So were these lumberjacks seeing a real creature like the devil moose, or was it just some lark that they were making as a ruse to scare their fellow lumberjacks? That's the most difficult part of this research, is trying to sort fact from fiction.
God, I love that, the devil moose. These creatures themselves, do we know any water creatures? Obviously we talk about the woodland beasts and such, but are there water creatures surrounding the lumberjack encampments and strange beasts that might be dangerous around the water holes?
They talked about a lot of funny water creatures along with some dangerous ones, like the furred trout. It was a trout that in the cold north, they grew fur to stay warm, or the antlered trout, or the flying fish that would jump out to get mosquitoes in the water. And they started jumping out so much that they became more comfortable living outside of water, and they started living in the trees along the rivers and eating mosquitoes that way. So you had that segment of creatures, but then you also had the traditional lake monsters or sea serpents that these lumberjacks would report, because many of them did their lumbering around rivers and lakes. And in the spring, when the snow melted and it raised the rivers up, that's when the lumberjacks would put all the logs in the river and shoot them down to the lumber mills. So they were on the water, and they reported what we consider today to be these sea serpents.
All right. And do these beings play much into the nature of local lakes and still water, sources for them as well? Or are they more of the big lake, Superiors and Lake Michigans and things like that? Are they more cited in that kind of locale?
A lot of them were cited in your local rivers, lakes, and streams. And just in Wisconsin, I've collected over 40 different lakes, rivers, and streams that were thought to or are thought to currently have lake monsters inhabiting them. And many of them, when you go to them, they're not quite as deep as they once were, where you could almost walk across the lake and you think there's no way a 40-foot serpent-like creature that was said to be taking hogs and cattle right off of the banks of the shoreline and devouring them could ever go undetected in here. But I'm amazed at how many of these creatures were inhabiting places that weren't what you would think of as Lake Superior, where pretty much anything could be in it. It's so gigantic. These were areas that were confined, but yet they still had monsters, leading some to believe that maybe they're not real flesh and blood creatures like you would think of as a sturgeon or a catfish. Maybe there's something more supernatural to them.
All right. Very cool. I love this kind of stuff. Again, just kind of, it gives, I think, an interesting and introspective look to the histories of these locations. Do we notice as time progresses and we come into a kind of a newer Enlightenment era, if you will, and I don't mean to make it sound like I believe lumberjack are dumb. That's not my point. But obviously, what we could talk about in the 1800s with wonder and awe, in today's standards would probably be very mundane and explainable. Has there been an evolution of these stories as they grow and build, or do you find that they're all still kind of that rustic, back homesy feel to the kind of stories and encounters that are still shared today?
The old stories and folklore, not only with the lumberjacks, but others that were recorded by the folklorists and scientists and sociologists, they differ much more than the new stories, even of these same creatures, where I think what has happened is that as these researchers have come out with these legends over the years, every few decades, it seems like every researcher put their new spin on it or collected new stories that changed a bit. For instance, a new thing about the jackalope is that they only mate during thunderstorms, and that's the only time they mate. And there are other creatures that when they mate, they go invisible. And those are new creations that the lumberjacks never told of, but they've become ingrained in our society. And that doesn't just happen with these lumberjack creatures. Most recently, I've been receiving a lot of Wendigo reports from people who believe that they encountered the Wendigo because they heard something in the woods mimicking their voice or their friend's voice, trying to lure them into the woods. And when they go back and search it, they find that a lot of modern pop culture has put that into the Wendigo legend, that they have this ability to mimic human voices and cry out and try to get you to come help them. But the original literature, the original folklore, never mentioned any of it. In fact, it was said that if you heard the Wendigo, you'd be frozen in fear, and then it could come and hunt you and you'd be unable to move. But TV shows like Supernatural on WB or CW now and others talk about the Wendigo having mimicking properties, and that's become part of the pop culture.
So there are those aspects of these stories that seem to evolve. But, could it be said, too, that the paranormal has learned to adapt and change, knowing that what it might have been able to do to frighten us in the past isn't working because we've become a different breed of humanity. So amping up their abilities, evolving, changing, it sounds almost like the Predator. Remember when the Predator would be able to record snippets of the voices and play them back to lure people in? And, it was this unseen force in the woods. It almost felt like that was kind of lending itself to the Wendigo storyline.
I love that theory. I really love it because sometimes people in this field, if something's too bizarre, doesn't perfectly fit into a category, they think it must just be wrong or made up or embellished. And for me, when you deal with the weird, what is too weird? Where do you draw the line?
Right.
And I think if you drew the line at weirdness, you might miss out on a lot of stories. Remember some of the first tellings of the Chupacabra? If you said there was this spiked creature roaming around, sucking the blood of animals, people would say that's too weird. I don't know of any history of this. Where did it come from? It can't be real. And I think you hit the nail on the head where these stories adapt and they move and they evolve. Why wouldn't these creatures evolve? Like, for instance, again, back to the Wendigo. If any of your listeners Google the Wendigo, you'll probably see an image or a depiction of it with antlers or horns, like some giant elk-like creature. Again, the early literature had none of that, but that's not to say that's not what the creature is today. Because eventually, when you get enough sightings and you get enough reports, it does become what it is, whether it was created through pop culture or actual sightings. At some point, that does become the folklore.
Right. Yeah, it certainly gives you that perspective, doesn't it?
And I love your idea of why wouldn't these things evolve if they've been around for thousands of years? Maybe they have evolved into mimicking human voices or becoming expert at hiding or trickery or all kinds of other things that we see with a lot of these weirder reports.
Well, listen, we've caught video and photographs of strange things moving through the water, things that seem to defy logic or explanation. We've captured images like Patty, the Patterson-Gimlin Bigfoot, and there have been others that are compelling, certainly to say the least. But what of these other creatures? Is there any known examples of evidence that you felt, well, this goes beyond just a story? There's some evidence to this aspect of history or I don't know what's the word, folklore. There's real elements to this.
I think the Tote Road Shagamaw that I mentioned that has different hooves of bear, moose, and others, when people were reporting it, it looked very similar to what we would consider the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch. And I think that a lot of these reports may have came from legitimate reports of these creatures. Because again, these lumberjacks and these pioneers were in places where most people were not at. They weren't exploring, they stayed out of them, and they were there for long periods of time. And I have many reports of the lumber camps stating that they found huge footprints in the dirt or the snow of some thing not wearing any shoe or sock or boot and of gigantic proportions. But they didn't have the concept of Bigfoot at the time, so they just came up with the wild man, that it must be a crazed lunatic living out in the woods by itself, some giant creature running around, instead of seeing it as a Bigfoot. So I think a lot of these legends do have a bit of fact to them. How much fact, I think, varies per legend, but without a doubt, many of them are based on traditional sightings.
How much do they tie into the local indigenous people's belief systems?
A lot of the lumberjacks were Native American, and First Nations people. So they brought their stories with them. What most people don't realize is a lot of the lumber taking was done on reservations, on the land of the native people that signed contracts, usually much to the benefit of the lumber company rather than the indigenous people. But they would tell their stories as well. And what we received in these lumber camps is you'd have, as I said, 10 different cultures from maybe 30 different countries, all telling stories and legends and giving their take with it. So oftentimes when we think of these legends as being one culture or one type of community, they were often influenced by many others in that region too.
Very cool. I love this kind of stuff. I'm glad there are people like you out there putting them together in a book form so that we can continue to read our rich history, because there's something to be said for why these stories exist, what they mean and what they represent. I'm often, Tim and I are often asked, do we really believe all the stories we hear on the show? Not necessarily, but I'm intrigued by the concept of why the people telling us the stories believe, because that in itself has a really interesting aspect of what we are and what this human experience really means.
I couldn't agree more. When I first got into this field almost 30 years ago, I was thinking, I'm going to find out what this ghost is. I'm going to solve this case. I'm going to figure out this UFO case. And what, for me anyway, I learned very quickly is that if you go into it like that, you often burn out very quickly. That a lot of my colleagues who started out when I did, they no longer are interested in it because that was their mindset, where early on, I shifted to seeing it as an adventure, that collecting this folklore, seeing these stories, collecting them, interviewing witnesses. And I'm with you where, do all these witnesses' stories, do I find them 100% believable? No, but I'm fascinated by them. At some point, it almost becomes where the stories are irrelevant. It's the effect on a culture, on our people, and what these stories mean to us that I think is much more important than whether the ghost is of a curse or a former landowner of the area.
Right. Very cool. Well, keep us in mind. What's the next project you're working on, Chad?
I'm doing some hobo stories of legends of supernatural. Again, I'm on that peripheral of the supernatural.
Right.
I'm working on circus and carnival legends of the supernatural. And, I've done so many haunted books and UFO books and cryptids. I love it. But I like that fringe stuff that nobody's digging their paws into.
Well, please keep us in mind. When do you think the new book's going to be out?
By the end of the year, I'll have the Hobo Supernatural book out.
I love that, the Hobo Supernatural book. Make sure you reach back out to us. Let us know when it's available, Chad. We'd love to have you come back and visit with us.
Hey, keep an eye out.
Will do. Lumberjack Creatures of the Northwoods, out and available right now. There's a link for it on today's program guide, so make sure that you check it out and get the book. Rate and review the book afterwards as well. That always helps out the authors. Let me remind you again, tonight we do have our live show. It is our live stream. It is going to be taking place at 9 p.m. Central, 10 p.m. Eastern. That's 7 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Mountain Time. Tonight, the manifestation. You're going to want to be here as we talk with Stanford professor and physician about manifestations, not infestations, but intention setting, and how it can affect our lives, our brains, and the perspectives of the things around us, including our own health. Dr. Greg Hammer, our guest tonight on the live program. We'll be back next week with even more of the best in paranormal talk radio. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Dave, that's Tim, and this is Darkness Radio.